it's a development conference, and there are many ways in which development economists have studied the way to economic prosperity, and we think that part of the answer to this is indeed access to Bill's map, the fact that countries can serve markets other than their own. And we know that this is not the whole story, but at least it's part of the story. And there's some research that supports this in a plausible and causal sense. Papers by Frankel and Romer, Siscard and Noguer. And but you also just need to be a casual observer of the world, and you can see that the rise of China is if not driven, it commensurate with its rise in global trade and Asian tigers before that. And there are many sources that trade economists have thought about what drives success in trade, what drives the pattern of trade, and so on. Technology, the endowments you have in a country, the geography of your country, how close you are to other markets, and internal geography as well. There are also interesting interactions between geography and technology, and also institutions. In fact, I should have also added another bullet point, because in fact there is very interesting research about ethnic networks in international trade as well. So whatever the source of success in international trade and economic success seem to be correlated. So I'm going to go through 3 figures now to illustrate this point. So here I have a figure that is a very simple-minded figure, that on the x-axis you have the log of GDP per capita, a marker of income and well-being. And on the y-axis, the vertical one, you have the total exports per capita. Okay, so this is an extremely high correlation of 0.2. In economics or in the world in general, it hardly ever gets better than that. But then, if you start looking a little bit more deeply, we can look at the top 20 products that countries export. And these are, I'll talk a little bit more about how we classify these things, but you can see that also the bulk of success in trade, in fact, because the x-axis has not changed, the bulk of it is really coming from the top export products, and there's a very tight correlation there as well. And even if you look at the entire dyadic matrix of products and where they are shipped to, you still see the top 20 export flows, where a flow is a product that is sent to a particular destination. So Bill's flowers, for example, a flower cut in Ecuador and sent to New York. This is one observation here. If you add up 20 of those for each country, you still get an incredibly tight correlation. And these facts motivate us to study, in fact, the top part of the distribution of export flows, both at the level of the product, but also at the level of the destination. So I'm going to show you 3 facts, and then I'm going to draw some conclusions for policy and for development more generally. So first, it actually turns out that hyper-specialization in exports is surprisingly high. Hyper-specialization is a phenomenon that's been observed in many dimensions, in physics, in geography, in human outcomes, and so on, and indeed also in international trade. And this is something that holds also both at the product level. So countries specialize, and this is but they really specialize in a handful of successful products, but also in terms of destinations. But what is perhaps much more interesting is, and what is more new about our research, is that these patterns of specialization are actually not very stable. In the following sense, if you rank products from the biggest product, biggest export category, whether by product or also by destination, the ranking of these things are incredibly volatile. So you also have a phenomenon of the ranking changing, but also new things enter this category of let's call it great success, the top 20 export flows or products, but it actually doesn't matter so much at which point you define this great success, whether it's the top 10 or top 20, top 50. We see very, very similar phenomena, and I'll show you tables, one table that will speak to that. It seems that countries that are more developed, in fact, have less of this churning, a little bit more persistence, but it's still big even for rich countries. So in some sense, rich countries and poor countries are in fact very similar, but there are some nuances there that I will talk about in a bit. And we also take great care. I'm not going to talk about it here, but we actually take great care in the paper to show that all of this is not just plain measurement error. So statistical agencies reporting or governments or customs misreporting and things like that. This can't be a major part of this churning and volatility that we observe. And then we're going to try to study the sources of this instability. And in fact, we find that factors that can be attributed to characteristics of the state of the exporting state can only explain 40% of the variation in this churning. So if you take the variance of this churning, only 40% is driven by characteristics of the exporter, and even that I'll show you that there's a nuance to that, so it may be even less. What is the rest? The rest are things that are driven by destination, demand. Bilateral is actually part of something that's related to the exporter, residual demand, and product demand globally. So So I want to say a little bit what is new here and why is any of this interesting. So hyper-specialization, as I alluded to, has been noticed in many dimensions in life, and also in trade. People have noticed this hyper-specialization. We bring to the table a new, fresh look at this, but this is not actually what we think that is particularly new. What is interesting is that this instability has been largely unnoticed, and the fact, and not only is it not noticed, the persistence of the low persistence of rankings and product categories over not very long periods of time. Okay, we're not talking about hundreds of years here. We're actually going to talk about 12 years. So this persistence is surprisingly low, and we think that this is interesting and new. We also find that, as I mentioned, that the sources of instability lie outside of the focus of traditional trade theory and outside of the state as well. There is a paper by Eaton, Kortum, and Karl Marx that actually says, well, if you want to explain how the distribution of trade, you actually need to take into account demand factors as well. Technology and productivity at the firm level is not enough. But they don't talk actually about the churning. They only look at cross sections. So their paper completely misses on what we find as very interesting and intriguing. And why is this interesting? Well, because it has actually some implications for policy, even though I wouldn't go and tell any minister what to do. But perhaps I can give a little bit of advice on, or we can give a little bit of advice on how to shift a little bit emphasis. So the fact that there is so much churning in itself is interesting because it really doesn't support stories of huge investment into particular industries and in terms of protection and so on. And in fact, maybe as I would say in the end as well, maybe what we need is actually just promoting blanket policies that just make the environment better in general without actually picking winners. So two papers that we kind of take a punch at are these papers by Ricardo Hausmann and Danny Roderick, which we enormously admire otherwise. But they allude to this notion that because of all kinds of reasons like informational externalities and so on, we are actually doomed to choose. So it is actually necessary to choose winners and their externalities that justify intervention. Our results show that, well, okay, maybe, but there are other things that may be even more important than this. especially because of the instability of these patterns and the source. And they also have a paper that say, well, you know, what you export is what you are. So if you manage to export to rich, technologically developed countries, that will have an impact on your own country. Well, maybe it's not a choice. Maybe these are things that happen because of global demand outside of your control. So let me briefly talk about something that's really boring, where the data that we use come from. It comes from the United Nations. It's a data set called Comtrade. We decided at some point to look at something that's called 4-digit level of disaggregation. It's a technical point, but you can think about this as a level of disaggregation that is not blue shirts with collars, but let's think about it as shirts, okay? Shirts for men, things like that. So it is a level of aggregation that is fine enough to define industries and to talk about Ricardian technological forces without sacrificing too much the arbitrary fact that, you know, one day I export a blue T-shirt, but the next day I export T-shirts for men and then T-shirts for children. This is going to show up as something different. So we think that this is a good unit of analysis. Our sample is 98 to 2010. We choose this in order to maximize, in some sense, a stable panel of countries. And we're going to talk a little bit about 3 types of goods. There's going to be all the goods that fall into 4 digits. We're going to talk a little bit about commodities. Commodities are agricultural products and things that are close to primal sources. So I have an example here: cotton, carded, or combed. Extractables are what you think of, the stuff that you take out of the earth. With almost no processing. Okay, you need to process things a little bit in order to actually ship it somewhere, but we go through these classifications very carefully and define this as a category. And the rest is what we call manufactured. So these can also be agricultural products, but they will show up as a manufactured good if they have a minimal amount of value added and to the product. And we're going to focus on Africa and other developing countries versus the OECD so that we can make comparisons and talk a little bit about development. And Africa and other developing countries are important as a focus because, as this figure, I hope, illustrates, growth in trade is actually coming from these countries in the world. OECD countries their trade has grown, and we know that anyone that's living in the US has, over the last 10, 15, 20 years has noticed that there's a lot more availability of things from the rest of the world. But it's actually the developing countries that are pushing very, very strongly global trade. So the juxtaposing developing countries versus OECD is actually important. Okay, so the first fact: hyper-specialization is surprisingly high. What this table shows, I'll try to what this table shows is this ranking of 20 products and the shares that they take in total trade of a country. So you see here, the numbers are enormous. The top 20 products for African countries take 87% of their total trade, but even after you take out extractables and commodities, it's still 80%. Okay, so it's enormous. You see that there's a little bit less concentration for other countries, and even a little bit less than for the OECD. But if you actually stare, if you can stare at the lowest rank here, you see that the 20th good actually has a surprisingly similar share in Africa and in the OECD. So what this says is that all of this concentration is really coming from the very, very top ones. And this further motivates us to focus on these top products. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but this is basically telling the same stories if you look at the product by destination dimension. So what do you learn from this? Exporting is highly concentrated on a few successful products, and they account for a surprisingly large share of trade, which guides our focus on that. And perhaps in this room it's less interesting, but actually there's not a lot of theory about why concentration is so extreme. We know how to model it, but we don't know how to explain it. sometimes models are fig leaves for our ignorance. And so, so let me move on. Instability. This is a really interesting new fact. We have here a ranking of the top 10 products of Ghana. Yao is here, so we need to talk about Ghana. And you don't see the names, but I'm going to give you some examples. And then the arrows indicate where they were, this is in 98, and the arrows indicate where they ended up in 2010. And also, we add to this list of products in 2010 the products that ended up being in 2010 top 10 and where they started. And one of the things that you can see here is that there are some products that managed to get into the top 10 that started from 0 or virtually 0. Okay? You can do this for Tanzania, okay, another African country from the east side of that continent. But you can also do this for the US. And the figures, and we have a bunch of these in the paper, and we could do more if we had more time. This is pervasive. So in order to make this point more rigorous, I'm going to show you a table that's not complicated. What this table shows you are rank correlations. So if you take the correlation of in this table, top 20, for example, in 98 and then in 2010, and you look what is the correlation just of the ranks. And you see it's surprisingly low, on the order of 0.3. There's some variation in this table that I don't have time to talk about, but the main takeaway message, at least in terms of this churning, is it's remarkably similar for African countries and OECD. So we're in New York, so we need to pay tribute to one of my favorite bands, the Talking Heads. So as a paraphrase on one of their best albums, more songs about churning and cut flowers. So here are some examples. Ghana, the top 2 exports in 98 were cocoa and gold, and they switched places, but the switching actually involves a huge increase in the level for gold. Aluminium plates actually went from the 18th place to the 3rd. Tanzania, the top 3 were nuts, coffee, and fish, famously. And these actually shifted down considerably, but copper, manganese, and other precious metal ores, which were not exported at all of a sudden, they show up as ranks 2, 3, and 4. So this is the kind of taste of things that we are seeing. Manganese is interesting because you see this also both in Ghana and in Tanzania, and the increase in both of these countries is in fact similar, which indicates something about global product demand. So these countries are actually managing to ride the tide of manganese, so to speak. But there are also differences because they're not shipping the stuff to the same places. Ghana's top destination is Ukraine, but for Tanzania it's China. Perhaps there's a geographical element there. Tanzania is slightly more close to China than Ghana. And coming back to the cut flowers, there's also we've detected some interesting patterns in terms of crowding out. So it's not only what you're doing is affecting your exports, but also what other countries are doing. They manage to actually crowd out. So we have a few examples here. So for the US market, Colombia and Ecuador are the biggest winners in terms of riding this demand for cut flowers. But they crowd out Mexico, which is much closer to the US, as you know, and Guatemala. In Africa, Kenya has managed to crowd out Israel and Morocco, but Kenya is managing to do this even though Tanzania and Uganda are in the neighborhood and they're not doing it. So there is some scope for maybe there's something that maybe there's crowding out, and maybe this is maybe what one country does actually has an effect on another country that is a neighbor. And then what is the takeaway message from all this is that source, destination, product dimensions are interacting in ways that are interesting and important, we think, and so I'm going to analyze this a little bit more rigorously in the next slide. Okay? The sources of this instability. It's not a primarily source country story. It's not. We cannot trace all of this to the exporters and what's happening there. So, there's a little bit of math, but I'll explain this. I hope very clearly. So, X here is the growth in the export of some product P that's originating in some source country S that is being shipped to some destination country D. Okay? Hence the dimensionality of X, S, D, P. Okay? And you can write down all the possible dimensions that this thing can be attributed to. Okay? There is something that is fundamental about the country. This is this letter theta S. There are things that can be attributed to variation in comparative advantage. So at the country level, variation across products is going to indicate variation in comparative advantage, whatever the source of that is. You can also have variation due to bilateral relationships, so countries sign trade agreements and so on. There is also global demand for a particular product. This is the letter gamma P. There's stuff that happens in each destination. Some countries grow better, and that will be showing up in this delta factor, which signifies the success of destination countries as importers. And there's also specific demand for products in every destination, and this can also be driven by either tastes or the particular suitability of an input into their production mix, anything that can be done there. And the way we're going to define growth here, in order to capture exactly both the growth and the entry and exit, you cannot just use the growth rate. It's a technical point. We're going to use something that's bounded growth that can actually take into account the entry and exit. So we're actually taking into account in this equation entry and exit, which is an important thing. So I just wanted to bring that point, whether the equation makes any sense to you at all or not. And what we do is we're going to estimate all of these components, okay, which is a formidable task that I need to pay kudos to Diego because I'm not sure that I could have done it so efficiently. And so we can estimate all of these. So this is a very, very large numbers of things that we need to estimate, okay? All of these S, so it's a huge number, okay? And if you have many sources, many dimensions, and many products. So multiply each one, that's the number of things that we need to estimate. And then we're going to take a variance decomposition of these elements and try to see which one is more important, okay? And the result is summarized in this table. So first of all, we can do this by region, okay? For the average country in the world, we can attribute the total amount of a variation into different sources. And so what you see here is, first of all, the main takeaway message is that source and product, so variation and comparative advantage, can explain only 20% of what we see in the data. You can add to that, if you wish, source by destination. This is the bilateral part of the variance. But remember, it's bilateral, so there are two people involved, or two countries involved. So it's not only the source country. It's probably related, but not only. And these are exports, not imports. So probably the destination country is more important in determining these bilateral, the variation bilateral things. We also find the residual is actually quite important for many countries, okay? And there's other numbers, but the headline numbers are really 40% versus 60%. 60% is outside of the possibility of what you would think of as industrial policy to control, okay? And we also, in the paper, we do a little bit of trying to see whether it's systematic that poorer countries, less developed countries have higher shares at the country level. It turns out that is systematic. So there. But overall, the picture is very similar, both for developing and less developed countries. So I'm on time. It's amazing. Let me just conclude and tell you what I would like you to take away from this talk. First of all, that churning within the top exports of the country, which, remember, we're talking about upwards of 50% of exports for OECD countries and upwards of 80% for less developed countries, African countries. This is surprisingly high. The churning, where it matters, is very, very strong. And, you know, it's not exactly consistent, or it's at odds, at least, with trade theory, which is usually static models, okay? That relies on stable patterns of comparative advantage. And also the importance of non-source country dimensions in this churning. So the churning is immense, and we cannot trace a whole lot of it to the source country. And it suggests that attributing export successes and failures to country characteristics or country policies may be exaggerated. Maybe what you need is not a particular policy focused on a particular product. What you need is a good environment and perhaps letting entrepreneurs do what they do best. I think that's enough, and I'll stop here exactly on time. And I believe that now I can take questions, and I'm happy to answer.
This was fascinating. Thank you. Michael Clemens from Center for Global Development. So my questions were about theory and policy. I think it really needs some theory. The theory for concentration is kind of easy to imagine. There's a good reason why not everybody in New York does the same job. There are lots of non-traded services and goods to provide. It's easier to imagine why it might be more concentrated, what New Yorkers do for Alaskans. There's a limited number of goods and services that New Yorkers can provide to Alaskans. It might be clearer which ones of those are the most profitable. People would concentrate in them. The volatility, however, is just much harder to theorize, much harder to understand. And in particular, it really flies in the face of the Haussmann Hidalgo monkeys swinging from trees. A series of papers claiming to document that what you can export next period is heavily dependent on what you're exporting now, and clusters of complementary products. And I wonder if what we're seeing is not shifts in fundamental comparative advantage at all, but just attempts that are not successful in the process of exploration. A paper that I think you might have cited, development as self-discovery, is the story of repeatedly trying and failing to export stuff, learning about comparative advantage rather than changing comparative advantage. But theoretically, clarifying that would be really helpful. And about policy, one has to wonder after seeing that if it is in fact comparative advantage that is so volatile, whether your results are compatible with the infant industry argument.
I don't think that this analysis is contradictory to the trial and error story. If anything, I think it fits in very well. I think that what we do think is somewhat inconsistent with our findings is the picking winners and investing heavily in some industries where now we know that these things may not be around. And there's some research about this as well. Zhonghua Li has work on protection of industries in Korea during the period of their boom, and with very interesting results showing that actually the industries that are protected are exactly the ones that rapidly disappeared and did not show productivity gains. So this is a thing that we take issue with. So in terms of theory, there is some theory about this, but it's very, very unsatisfactory in the sense that it's very ad hoc. So you can write statistical models that can generate volatility, but nobody really understands what are the sources of these volatilities. And that's something that is definitely interesting and worthwhile pursuing. Bill wants to answer also.
One other reaction to the trial and error theory of Haussmann and Roderick. The other result from this paper that would sort of contradict that approach is, even if you do find a success, it's not going to last very long. So the whole idea that you should invest enormous effort in discovering what your comparative advantage is sort of makes less sense if whenever you discover it, you only get to enjoy it for a few years, and then you get displaced by someone else, and you yourself move on to something else. It seems much more compatible with a much more free-flowing model where you just allow everyone to keep seizing new opportunities as they come along.
I wanted to ask about the spatial dimensions of industrial concentration for a couple of reasons. So My recollection in the studies of the U.S. industrial locations tend to indicate remarkable stability of industrial locations. So the glass industry grows up in one place and pretty much stays there similarly. So that suggests that a couple of things that might be relevant here. One is larger countries might be more successful just because they have more varieties of locations. And it may also affect their political economy because now some of what's going on is a kind of spatial competition within the country that could be very interesting. So I think it would be interesting to look at the extent to which this change that's happening in industrial specialization is also associated with changes in the location of economic activity, and then think more about some of the implications of that. Does this suggest a different growth potential for larger countries? How does this affect the politics of development policy within countries? But fascinating research. I think it's starting a whole bunch of interesting questions in those dimensions.
Thanks, Thorsten Beck, Cass Business School. Also very exciting research. I have a question and a comment. My question, and maybe you've mentioned this, I just missed it. Are you working with value data or volume data? Because there might be a difference. Now my comment is on the specialization and whether we should be surprised about this, the rapid changes or not. And also linking back to the comment on the comparative advantage. Now, if I think about comparative advantage, I would think about comparative advantage on the, let's say, textile industry level, which I guess is like 2 digits. I probably wouldn't think about comparative advantage on the 4-digit level or for dress shirts for men. So, so I think your findings that there are rapid changes is in the export specialization is probably not surprising. The question is more on which level is it? Is it really on the product level? Is it on the industry level? On which level actually does it happen? If it's on the industry level, then maybe we should be worried, or we should be looking for a theoretical explanation. But actually, having a rapidly adjusting industry specialization, export specialization within a certain industry, from dress shirt for men to female clothing, to children textile or whatever, or shoes. I mean, that's probably just adjusting maybe to the market demands. And maybe that shows a very well-supported active export industry as opposed to one industry which just exports in one area and then not in others. So yeah, so that's my comment in terms of what can be shouldn't it actually be expected to see this very high change in specialization, at least on the product level, not necessarily on the industry level.
So I'll answer to these 2 questions. So these are definitely interesting dimensions to examine. First of all, whether country size determines export success, and there's some we know from gravity equations that the size of the country matters. But those are very static approaches, and there's a little bit of research on dynamic gravity equations that actually show that all those things are once you throw in lags of things for total volumes for countries, all these other things that people emphasize in trade theory are really unimportant, or diminish in importance enormously. But yeah, definitely we would need to think a little bit more about the political economy implications and so on. But that's an interesting thing to think about size and concentration in the domestic level in terms of explaining this volatility. In terms of the level of aggregation, going to Thorsten's question, first of all, we're trying to avoid exactly this point about T-shirts of this kind and T-shirts of that kind. Actually, what I unsuccessfully explained this. No, the level of aggregation that we're looking at actually avoids these kinds of mini micro variations. It's true that you can think of a higher level of aggregation as something that is perhaps more fundamental to the country. But at the end of the day, it is a taxonomy, because at the end of the day, if you aggregate all the way up, there is no volatility in comparative advantage left. And that's why at the 4-digit level, it's a technical point. You allow both for technological Ricardian forces, but also the Heckscher-Ohlin endowment forces to operate in a reasonable way. But one thing we could definitely do is try to do this at the 2-digit level, and that would actually be relatively cheap and see. We're definitely going to get less volatility. But the question is, as you pointed out correctly, what is the source of this diminished volatility? And I think that's also the more interesting finding here. Yeah, Bill wants to add.
Torsten, another reaction to your comment. We actually did worry about that a lot in kind of staring at these tables of entering and exiting goods. And not only from the standpoint that they could just be making minor shifts within the same industry like you suggested, but also we worried it could just be measurement error, that there could just be something reclassified to an adjacent category. And so we worried a lot about that, and we stared a lot at a lot of countries at the entering and exiting goods. And what really struck us over and over again is these are really in totally different categories, totally different industries. They're not adjacent within the same industry.
We see examples
They're not
of traditional, non-traditional exports overcoming traditional exports in ways that you wouldn't expect, not within what you call two-digit classifications. Okay. I think my time is up. Thanks a lot.